It's warm summer days, as we all know. And for those of us who live in Victoria and Penticton, we know that summer, while it's very nice, brings along the threats of forest fires in various areas. And I think we've all experienced them, perhaps some close at hand or just from the smoke from them. And so there were some significant fires early on in the observatory's history, and Preeti has uncovered a lot of documentation and information about these fires. So today she's going to talk a little bit about her project of overseeing the archives of the DAO, and then get into the details of the fires and get into some juicy stuff and some interesting stuff. So Preeti, take it away. You can share your screen.
Okay, sounds good. I'll just start sharing here. Okay, I think you can see everything now. All right, so hello everyone. As Dennis was saying, I will be presenting on a bit of the history of Observatory Hill and the site of our amazing workplace. So since the history of our site spans more than 100 years, I will be focusing on a small portion of those 100 years. To begin, I'll explain the archival processes that have been implemented on DAO's records, and I'll provide a quick overview of which records we have on site. This might be a little bit repetitive for those of you who attended my talk last year, but I know there might be some people here that haven't seen that portion or know about that. I will then get into more of a specific aspect of DAO's history, which will consist of 2 significant forest fires, as we've said. All right, so let's get started. To set the foundation of this presentation, I'll provide a bit of a background on DAO's history and give some context behind the project that I'm working on. So this is a very quick and short summary of the history of DAO. So of course it opened in 1918. That was a 72-inch telescope, and that was the largest in the world at the time of its completion. And the telescope was named after an influential astronomer, John Stanley Plaskett. And of course, we also have a second telescope on site, the 48-inch. We can't forget about that. It was inaugurated in 1962. All right, and so I'll just go through a couple of the pictures that are here. I'm sure many of you have seen this one here. It is from 1916. Some people think it is from 1918, but it is before the mirror actually came onto the site. And you can see Plaskett right here at the bottom left. And this is the inauguration of the 48-inch telescope. And this happened during one of the conferences that was taking place here in Victoria. And this inauguration actually kicked off that conference. All right, so due to the existence of the observatory, we're fortunate enough to have a vast number of historic records that enrich the history of the observatory, which has led to the archival project that I'm currently working on. So the purpose behind this project is to archive those records, and by doing so, we are preserving and ultimately giving the community a chance to access them. After all, the purpose of records in general is to provide information and knowledge for those who seek it. So at this point, you're probably wondering, what records does the DAO have? In terms of their format, they're basically textual, graphic, electronic, and artifacts or objects. However, most of the collection is made up of textual and graphic material. Photos make up a large part of the collection, and you'll be seeing some of them throughout my presentation. From my approximation, we have currently about 3,000 photos on site. We're quite fortunate to have such a collection of photos because they provide almost a complete perspective of the observatory's history from the very beginning. So about 1913, 1914, we have photos from then. And on the other hand, textual material, that's also very important, which also dates back to the beginning. Much of it consists of correspondence, research reports, and site maintenance information as well. And so I'll just take a moment here to explain a couple of the photos. So on the left-hand side here, you will see standing William Campbell. He is from the Lake Observatory. Beside him, this woman, I'm actually not too sure who she is. She could be his wife, but I don't want to assume.
That is Campbell's wife, yes.
Okay, sounds good. And then, of course, we have Plaskett's wife with the tilted hat. And next to her is Ambrose Swayze from Warner and Swayze, the company that built the telescope, the mechanical parts for it, in order for the telescope to be operational. And then we have sitting on this chair, Brashear. We were just talking about him. And it was at his shop in Pittsburgh that the 72-inch blank was ground. So as a part of, or actually, sorry, I'm going to explain this photo here as well. This is correspondence from Petrie, and he is sending a letter to J.J. Woods. And J.J. Woods, you'll see this a little bit later, but he was from the experimental farm in Bannock, where some of the trees for the hill came. So you'll, as you can see, if you're reading this paragraph, it says about 30 trees were supplied each year. But this will come full circle because this will be explained later on as well. So as a part of the project, I've also created a finding aid, and it shows a list of theories and a list of records that are present. If you would like to see this in more detail, please let me know after the presentation, but I'll just be showing you really quickly as to what's here. Just from our quick glance here, you can see that the records that we have aren't just related to the DAO as an institution, but the individuals and organizations affiliated with it. You can see that there's correspondence, of course, and information about clocks that are up in the CU. Of course, we have information on Plaskett, Petrie, Pierce, and all of that. So now that you have an idea of what type of records we have, I'd like to speak about what is being done with these records from the archival perspective. These records at this time are being processed by me. Processing involves several steps, and I've highlighted them here. I will summarize each one. So processing in general means providing physical and intellectual access to the records, and it is done through these 5 steps. So first of all, we have appraisal, and appraisal determines whether materials have permanent value within the context of the institution, with the institution's existing collection. So appraisal is done by examining contents of the records, determining their provenance, so their origin, and evaluating their completeness and authenticity. Next, we acquire the records. So once the archivist has appraised the records and seen whether or not they should be donated to their institution, the act of taking legal ownership of the records takes place. So this involves a transfer of title, various acquisition policies that the receiving institution has to adhere to. It can vary from organization to organization or between archives as well. Sometimes it's pretty similar, sometimes it's not. And once we have the records within an archives, then comes the organization and arrangement aspect. So the organization of the records is done according to the relationship between the contents of the material. This step determines how records should be categorized within a series and sub-series. So it's a top-down approach. Physical arrangement is applied according to the size and type of records, and this also determines how and where they should be stored. So to give you a little bit of a better idea, I have a little diagram here. At the top, you see fond. So fond is basically, it differs from what we call a collection. Theoretically, within archives, there is a difference between a fond and collection. So for our purposes today, I will just be talking about a collection, and our collection at the DAO is actually called a collection. So from a font, you move down to a series. I will skip the sous-font and sub-series, but I will just move straight forward to the series part. And it says here, a series is, it's the documents within a series are arranged as a unit because they relate to a particular subject. So you have your entire collection, and within that you create various subjects. And now you're dividing up that collection in that format. And then you have your files. So each file then is categorized and arranged in terms of the subject that they're related to. And of course, within each file are separate items. And if you're still a bit confused with that, I have an example here from our finding aid. So at the top, you can see here, it says historic clocks. And historic clocks, that is the series within our collection. And within the series, now we have 3 files at the bottom. So one of them is the original documents of the clocks, and the originals were then photocopied, creating a second file. I photocopied them because we were using this file quite a lot last year, and these records are pretty fragile, and I didn't want too much handling with them, so I created a separate file for that. And then the last file we have is called The Beginning of the Long Dash. And this is the master copy of the book, The Beginning of the Long Dash. It was written by Malcolm M. Thompson, and he talks about timekeeping within Canada. And I think a lot of you are familiar with the Long Dash, CBC's Long Dash. So this is just an example of how everything is arranged and organized within archives and the archival perspective. And so while we arrange records, and even afterwards, the process of preservation comes into play. So preservation is the set of actions taken to prolong the life of records. This can be done in various ways, such as placing photos in protective sleeves or removing metal objects from papers like paper clips and such. Putting records through the process of conservation. Sometimes archivists actually have to send off records to conservators because they have special equipment, chemical-based materials that can actually easily help to prolong the life of records. And you can also store them in humidity and temperature controlled environments. And so the last thing we have is description. And description entails writing out basically what the collection is about and what records are within that collection, and just giving an overview. So if you were a researcher within an archive and you read the description of a specific collection, you'd know what was in it. And that includes biographical details of the organization or the person that the records belong to or were created by. There's the scope and content. So each series that I was talking about has a little bit of a little blurb or little description of what's in that series. And there's also a list of series themselves, just as I showed you in another slide, a complete, just simple list that is organized. So all of this information is organized within finding aids or box lists. Box lists are actually within each box. So if you're requesting a box of records at an archives and you find a list, you'll know exactly what files are in that box. And all of this is actually done through using RAD. And RAD is the Rules for Archival Description. It is a manual that shows all archivists across Canada what kind of standards to use while describing records. And I just have here a sample of the table of contents, one part of it, which shows you different types of records. So you have moving images, sound recordings, textual, graphic materials, and all of that. And it shows us how we should be describing all of those records. And that could include punctuation, special characters. It can be, and all of that has to be very consistent within all descriptions as much as possible. So we're all using the same sort of standard to describe everything. And so that is archival processing. Now that you have an idea of what records we hold and how they're described, this concludes the first part of the presentation. Now I will speak about the forest fires that have taken place on the Hill. The reason this topic was great to focus on was because our collection includes an entire file based on reforestation after the fires of 1934 and 1941. I will be speaking about these two time periods specifically. This file was actually added to our collection last year. I mean, it was on site, but it was added to our archival collection last year, and it was given to us by Clyde from Site Services. Along with this one file, there were others related to maintenance of the site, but this particular one, of course, caught our attention. It contains great information about the consequences of the fires and how the situation was handled each time. So all of the records that I've chosen to include have pieces of information that, in a sense, create a story from each fire. So I'd like to also note that some of the things that you'll be seeing, part of that is also my own research, and so you'll be seeing some records that are not necessarily part of this one file that I'm talking about. So you're probably now eager to see what types of records it has, and what you're seeing here is a timeline. And I know it probably looks really confusing and overwhelming right now, but it is a timeline of these specific fires. And not to worry, I will be closing in on each section so you can clearly view all of the items that are here. So I will start off with the fire of 1934. Which took place in August of that year. And so as Dennis was saying, you know, summers come with clearer skies, but also high risk of fire. I think I saw in the news yesterday, actually, that there is a massive fire warning pretty much all over BC. Last week, I saw a lot of smoke just outside my window, and I could smell it inside too. So I'm not sure where that was coming from, but of course it made me think of my talk. And so the fire of 1934, that's exactly what happened. We're seeing here in this newspaper clipping that the fire broke out on August 23rd, because this is a clipping from the day after. And we're seeing here that volunteer firemen here were up on the hill, but also people are actually military men, and they were called out from Esquimalt. So it says here, today the fire was still burning. So on August 24th, it's still burning. And the fire started shortly after 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And it started at the BC Electric Railway, right off near the entrance to to the main road leading to the observatory. Of course, it's described that the fire started due to the dryness of the underbush, and it spread quite quickly. And we also see that it was, I think it was on the southwest of the hill, and it went up a quarter mile. So basically stopped pretty much just at the road. It didn't quite go up to the dome, but it stopped at the road. And this clipping was taken from the Vancouver Daily Province. So we're seeing here that it was really dry. It was possibly quite hot as well. So in complement to that, I will show you some temperature readings, and this is historic data taken from the government's site, Canadian government site, and they have just archived weather data and whatnot. So as you can see, this is a monthly data report from 1934. If you look at August, the mean max temperature from August was 22.7 degrees. And that doesn't seem so bad. But as you can see, that the total rain also isn't too much. It's between June, July, and August, there wasn't as much rain, of course, as you can expect. But if we close in on this month, I just picked the 16th to the 28th, the 23rd and the 24th, the temperature is at 31.1 and 30 degrees as well. And there is pretty much no rain in these days at all. So the last three columns represent precipitation, and you can see all of them are at 0. So you're already seeing that the situation is not looking so good. And next we have, this is actually a graph that was created by Joseph Pierce, one of our former directors, of course. And he has labeled this graph as the monthly mean rainfall at DAO. And on the left, you can see inches of rain. So he has created this graph with pretty much an average of 20 years. It says 1918 to 1937. And then another line here of 1938. So I know that this year doesn't quite correspond to our 1934 fire, but it's a great way of looking at what to expect within those years, that span, and within those years, and just an average amount of rainfall that you can estimate. So in August, it always seemed to be under 1 inch of rain. So this corresponds to our monthly and daily record of weather as well. And his graph is pretty accurate in that sense. So far I've shown you what the cause of this fire was, but now I'd like to show you some things that describe the fire and the situation, and it was described by various individuals, so you'll have a bit of a different perspective from each. So right now, what you're looking at is, so it's an actual memorandum that was submitted by E.H. Finlayson, who was the director of Forest Service within the Department of the Interior. And it was submitted in 1935, in February of 1935. And if we zoom in on what he was saying, it says, with reference to your memorandum of December, he's talking about reestablishing a forest cover on Observatory Hill on Vancouver Island, which was burnt over last season. And he's quoting a report that was received from McFadden, Mr. McFadden, who was the district forest inspector at the Dominion Forest Service, who had recently, I guess, consulted with Dr. Harper as well at the observatory. So in order to kind of show you how they described it, it says in this paragraph, the third paragraph says 30 or 40 acres were burnt. And it says, even if you read on, it says the original stand was Douglas fir with a few cedar on the lowest part of some scrubby oak at the top of the slope. So the drier and more open places carried a growth of broom, of course, which broom is seen as a fire hazard. The greater part of this cover was killed, especially on the upper part of the slope. All the dead trees and vegetation is now being removed, and it is being done under contract. So by 1935, less than a year after the fire took place, only a few months actually, and so they're starting to clean up at this point. And now we have a photograph of what it looked like. This actually is a photograph from a scrapbook, and the scrapbook was created by Joseph Pierce in 1945. So I think he decided to take all of this information and take all of the pictures that he had and create the scrapbook, which was great, and it's a great resource to us today. And so he is describing this as West Saanich Road here, and the fire had jumped from Smith Place, which is in the background. And Smith Place, it was likely a private property just across the road, and the fire came from this direction. And to give you a little bit of a before and after of what the hill looked like, this is the hill before the fire from the southeast, and this is the hill after from the southwest. As you can see, there was a lot of damage, and it's basically barren, and it's just rock that you see. And I also have another description of what the fire, or what happened during the fire. Dennis actually forwarded this to me not too long ago, and it's quite interesting. It's a quote from Helen Hogg, which is in Northern Star, of the book written by Peter Broughton about Plaskett and his career and life. So Broughton has this quote from Helen Hogg, who described what happened during the fire that day. And I think it's quite interesting because when you listen to what she says and how she describes the fire, you can actually see how dire it was rather than reading it from newspapers. So Helen Hogg says, about 3 o'clock, some of the staff at the observatory looked out the windows and saw flames, burning trees on top of the hill, a couple of 100 feet from the director's house. There were only about 5 people on top of the hill at the time, and believe me, they did some scampering, getting out fire hoses and turning in the alarm. The first hour was the perilous time. Before the necessary equipment, a number of fighters had reached the scene. Huge clouds of smoke were clearly visible from the city, but the thousands of curious spectators who tried to get close were not allowed through police lines. Throughout the night, 200 men toiled in shifts to bring the fire under control. Their efforts severely hampered by a limited water supply. But with a change in wind, the firefighters prevailed, and by morning, the danger was over. About 5 square kilometers had been burnt over, including the electric light poles. The observatory gates were ruined, but no buildings were damaged, and no one was injured. It had been a very close call. So she describes it really well, and it creates a definite picture of what we would have seen had we been there. So after the fire, of course, there was recovery and reforestation. So the reforestation continued for years after the fire due to the extensive damage. Planting more trees was important for observation. As many of you already know, I'm sure, trees and other vegetation help stabilize the changes in temperature. And so rapid changes can cause the telescope to expand and contract, which affects its focus. But of course, planting more trees adds to the beautification of the hill, as it's a well-known landmark and a tourist attraction. Some of the directors, especially Pierce, I believe, was a little concerned about how the hill was going to look if people were to visit. So he wanted to make sure it looked somewhat like it did before the fire. So here's another picture of the entrance, or from the scrapbook actually, and it's a picture of the entrance. I know that we just heard from Helen Hogg that the entrance and the gates were damaged. So this photo could have been taken after the gates were maybe repainted or rebuilt, that sort of thing. I'm just not quite sure. So we have a couple of newspaper clippings here about the reforestation of the observatory. So the first one on the left, it says reforestation at the observatory, and this is from March 16th, 1935, so almost a year after the fire happened. And it says, it's pretty much the city is acknowledging the fact that the observatory is now trying to recover, and they are trying to do this because even they're saying the seeing conditions have been affected from an astronomical viewpoint, and that Harper, the acting director, he even brought this up to authorities in Ottawa, and they of course they were sympathetic to what he was saying and the issue at hand, and even the provincial Department of Forestry, they were cooperating by providing some trees and some nursery stock, it says, and they provided 500 cedar with the same number of spruce and of fir. So all of these trees were brought to the observatory, and not too long after the fire, which was great. But now we see the second clipping here, and it says tree planting aids astronomers. This clipping, this newspaper clipping, goes hand in hand with this piece of, it's a letter, it's a piece of correspondence. And so these two go together. If we take a closer look at this newspaper clipping, it says, Dr. Harper said that the astronomers are particularly interested in reforestation. Again, they're mentioning that the seeing conditions are quite affected, and that there was some glare and whatnot from the rocks that were now completely the rocks were very visible now without any cover, without any trees. And so it says here, during the recent months, that the area had been cleaned up and it was being readied for replanting. And it was being done under the contract of C.F. Dawson, who was the Dominion resident architect. And he was employing men from Thetis Lake to clean up the area. And the arrangements, again, had been made by the BC Forestry branch, part of the Department of the Interior, to do this reforestation. And it says here that 13,000 seedlings had been planted from the Green Timbers Nursery. So now if we move over to this letter here, it was written by Harper, I'm pretty sure, even though it's not signed, this is exactly how it looks. In March 10th of 1939, he tells Meldrum Stewart, the Dominion astronomer and from the Dominion Observatory in Ottawa, he tells him that actually 18,500 seedlings were planted, so more than what was reported. And he was very happy with the work that was done. And at the end, he says, I'm sending a colonist clipping to supplement, a colonist clipping to supplement the Times, sent 2 days ago. And so this clipping was exactly this one here. The Times Colonist is now is what it's called. This was the exact same clipping that he would have sent to Meldrum Stewart, which is very interesting. So keep in mind what we've just read and heard about Dawson. I'll move on to another document, another letter that speaks about reforestation, but in a little bit of a different way, and you'll see why. So I'm going to zoom in on halfway through this page here. And this, I should show you, this document is actually from October 5th, 1938. So we're going a little bit back in time. Before we were jumping from 1935 to 1939, a few years after the fire, the reforestation had continued. But if we move back 1 year, it says here, after the fire of 1934, Mr. Dawson led a contract to cut a fire guard about the grounds to this company, which was run by R.G. Kerr. And Dr. Harper will recall how many cords of wood were stolen off the hill at the time. So I'm just looking at this paragraph where my cursor is. And this was no small amount, as some large trees were cut down, I think, quite unnecessarily. And so this is Pierce telling Meldrum Stewart this information. It says, Mr. Dawson prepared the specifications that I recall, but did not discuss the requirements with Plaskett, who was director at the time. And then if we keep reading and we move on to this paragraph here near the end, I think J.E. Pierce did a little walkthrough with Kerr to show him what the grounds looked like. And actually what I'm going to show you is that we just saw that some of the trees were, or some of the woods were stolen. Some of the pieces of wood were stolen. And that was in this paragraph that you see at the top. And then afterwards, a few years later, 10 days ago, it says, more wood was stolen off the property. And so it's interesting that this is something that Pierce was already very concerned about, and that the wood had been stolen just after the fire of 1934. And now we're seeing this happen once again a few years later. So it says here, I reported this loss to C.F. Dawson, but Mr. Dawson, and moving on to the next page, advised me that he let this contract and that the observatory staff had nothing whatever to say about the direction of the work. And so, of course, Pierce was letting him know that he'd have to report this to the police and whatnot. And the so-called, I guess, what you might say, the excuse was that Mr. Carrot instructed his men to burn the wood, but the men didn't see that fit because the wood was too good to burn, and so they decided to take it off the property. So afterwards, Pierce thought, okay, like, we've dealt with the situation. They probably won't do it again. But you can see that he, at the end, the very last line, he was eager for Dr. Harper to return in order for him to take a look at the situation and the wood that was present. I think Dr. Harper was actually in Germany at the time, having some procedures or health issues that were happening, and he was in Germany for that at the time. So these documents show you the problems that came with that came with the fires. But after the fires, these are things that you don't expect. These are problems that you definitely wouldn't expect to be experiencing after all this damage that you're trying to deal with. So I thought that was really interesting, that these are the inner workings of the observatory and what you probably wouldn't know otherwise. It's not common knowledge. So after the fire of 1934, I just want to quickly talk about other fires before I get into the fire of 1941. There were other fires that took place in the area, so on the island and even on the mainland, that affected observations in 1938 specifically. So again, we have a graph here that was made by J.A. Pierce, and now this graph is actually about the monthly mean hours of observing. And so now he is trying to see what the average of over 20 years was, but also in 1938. So on the side here, on the left side, are the hours, and at the bottom here are the months. And so the one we want to actually look at is July. In July, he says, smoke from fires, from forest fires, prevented observing July 19th, July 27th, so for 9 days or so, that observing was affected. And so if we take a look at 1938, the dotted line, the hours are a little bit less than the 20-year average, between the 100 and 125 hour mark. And you'll see how this correlates and why 1938 was a year that was affected in the summertime. So in May 14th of the same year, we get a bit of a warning for forest fires on apparently a Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, due to temperatures and high temperatures and low humidity. They were sending out a warning that there could be a chance of forest fires. So if we look at the temperature and what they're talking about and what it was, this is a monthly report from 1938. And if we look at July, the mean max temperature was 24.4. And total rain was 2.3 millimeters. And of course, the last few months, and even August, there's barely any rain. And if we look at the months more closely, you can see how high these temperatures are. It's like around the 18th, even there's 30 degrees, 32 degrees. Even closer to the middle of the month, the 13th was 31 degrees. And the last three columns are all at zero. So barely any precipitation at all at those times, or none showing here in this snapshot. And so related to that, we see island tourist areas not affected by the forest fires, because it turns out that if you look at halfway through this clipping, Campbell River, they're saying it was perfectly safe at this time, but I believe that there was a large fire that took place just before this. This was a little bit of a typo on this clipping, so it was actually July 22nd, not June. But if we fast forward to a few months or a couple months later, we see in September that it was reported that more fires took place that year than all of the year before, than all of last year. It says 1937. So of course, 1938 was not a great year in terms of forest fires. It was very hot. And you can see why Pierce is showing that observation was quite badly affected. So now if we move into the fire of 1941, says that July 14th, 1941 was when the fire took place, but the fire was actually started by a camper, unfortunately. If we look at this clipping, it says the worst fire over the weekend. So there were more fires that took place on the 14th or a couple days before. The worst one was, of course, on the hill. And it kept Saanich firemen very busy from 11:05 yesterday morning until 9:30. And of course, as we said, it started with a camper, and we see that the fire burst out in the grass and bushes on the west side of the mountain as well. And there was dry undergrowth, and it was very close to the observatory at the top of the hill. And this was taken on July 14th, 1941. Again, we're seeing dry conditions, and if we take a look at the monthly report, the temperatures around that time in July, it was 23.5, the max mean temperature in this road, the second row here, 23.5, which doesn't seem so bad. But if we take a look at the total rain, the third last column, the total rain in millimeters was 2.8. This is quite a drastic change from the months before and after. The other years that we saw around the summertime, there wasn't much rain the months before or the months after, but here we see July, just all of a sudden there's absolutely almost no rain. So of course you can see that pattern building once again and moving into a bad situation. And July 14th also was, the temperature was reported at 33.9. The next day was 36.7. So it's just, again, bad situation, right? And so this is actually, I'll give you a bit of a visual of what happened after the fire of 1941, or actually during the fire. This is probably just the next day, the 14th or the 15th, I would likely guess. So I'll let you know who is in this photo. The person that's looking right at us, looking at, or at the water pump here, looking straight at the camera, his name is Joe Doby. So I spoke to Richard Pierce, who I think is listening in on today. Richard Pierce is Joseph Pierce's son, and he let us know about a couple of little facts about this photo. So this is Joe Doby. Apparently his left leg is actually a tin leg. You would not know this from looking at his photo, but apparently he has a tin leg, and but he looks quite happy and happy to be doing some work on the hill. Right behind him, who is the person who is wearing a vest, but not the hat. That would be Dukeman, who is the caretaker, the gardener, and he did lots of things around the hill at the time. So that's him standing there. And the two gentlemen with the hats, we're not quite sure who they are. Of course, their faces are turned away, and so it's almost impossible to know who they are at this time. And here's a second picture I just added for fun because it has a smoky effect. I think this is just smoke rising up from the underbush, and just gives you a cool photographic effect. So what happened after the fire of 1941? Again, we're in this recovery period, and reforestation needs to take place all over again. I have here a letter from J.A. Pierce to, again, Meldrum Stewart. And this is only a few months after the fire. And we see that about 100 red pine and 2 horse chestnuts were given to the observatory, and the replanting had already started at this time. And if we move into a couple of years later, because this, if you take note, is from November 1941, but a couple of years later, this is the spring of 1943. And here is a list of trees that I'm quite sure that Pierce was debating on ordering for the hill. So here's a few that he has outlined that he seems to be interested in. And again, after the spring of 1943, some of these trees actually correspond to the list that you just saw. So he likely did order, or the observatory ordered these trees in the end. There is the western dogwood, the sweet gum, scarlet oak, all of that. And if you look at this second paragraph, there's something to take note of, that 500 feet of water pipe was recently buried at this time, recently placed between the office and the dome at this time, with 6 to 8 water taps. So the date on this is November 2nd, 1943. And this is really interesting. This is actually a receipt from this time, where the trees that he's talking about in his letter are the ones that are in this receipt. And so the trees, as you can see, cost about $39, which seems like a really great deal for this time. And this is a photograph of Pierce, who is taking charge of what looks like is the burnt trees and bushes that were still on the hill. These men are cleaning up the hill in order to begin the replanting process. Okay, so we saw that 500 feet of water pipe was laid down at the hill. And so this letter here, which is actually from Meldrum Stewart to Pierce, talks about this. And so I'm just going back a few years. This letter is actually from 1939. And the letter that you saw just before this was actually from 1943. So if we go back in time a little bit here, you'll see why the piping or how that came about. I believe that Pierce was talking to Meldrum Stewart at some point and had advised that about 4,500 feet of additional piping was needed. And you can see that where the red arrow is at the top, that 4,500 feet of additional piping was proposed. But Meldrum Stewart seemed to have thought like that 500 to 1,000 feet would have been good, and that would have sufficed. So in the end, 500 feet was the chosen number, and that's how much piping was put on the hill after all. And if we take a look at this map, which is also from the scrapbook created by Pierce, I believe this map is updated in the sense that it was likely created after the piping was laid down, the extra 500 feet of piping, because you can see that if you see the solid lines, the marked lines, they one is connected from the office to the dome. So I talked to Marilyn Bell about this a little bit. We were trying to figure out what the X's were and what the H's were, and I thought the H's likely meant hydrants. And she actually let me know that the X's were probably where the water taps were and to connect the hoses in different areas of the hill. The H probably, they might not be hydrants because we don't think that there were that many hydrants around the hill, especially there's 4 near this water tank or water reservoir here. But these could also be connection points with the water piping. So as you can see that it's all connected. They're coming in from different parts of the hill and different sides of the hill, so it seems to be covered mostly. Just a note here at the bottom, there is a property, the Little property. I forget his first name, but this was owned by Mr. Little, and he was actually, I believe, a caretaker at the observatory, and lived pretty much on the grounds as well. And if we take a look at another map here from 1948, it looks like even in 1948, this property still existed as a part of Observatory Hill before it was bought out by the government to be made a part of Observatory Hill as government property. But here in 1948, these parallel lines that you see are all private properties. And so Little's property is somewhere down here, and it looks like it still exists in that same area. And so moving forward into the 1950s, after reforestation had taken place, now we're moving forward into the 50s. It actually continues. Petrie is now in charge. It is now 1957. He is the director, and even he is making the effort to make sure that the hill is now fully planted. And he is talking to J.J. Woods, as we spoke about earlier, the superintendent at the experimental farm in Sanishton. it says. So he's letting him know that, of course, the hill has suffered heavy losses in the past, and they're trying for some time to replace all the lost trees. And the astronomical seeing conditions have also been affected, of course, so he wants to bring that up to the optimum levels. And this is from 1957, but this is also from 1957 here, where J.J. Woods is, or actually, sorry, Petrie is letting him know again that he has somewhat of a personal preference as to which trees he likes, and he says he's quite fond of the broad-leaved maple, which seems to be doing quite well on the hill, because some of the trees actually didn't survive, and I think it just depended on what kind of trees were there and what the conditions were. So he had a personal preference for that, but of course he said there weren't any strong preferences overall. And so he wanted to make sure that only a certain amount of trees were brought to the hill in order to give them individual attention. Those individual trees then were watered and taken care of per season, and then the next batch would come in and be taken care of once again. So about 30 trees a year. And so this is our timeline. And of course, the reforestation and replanting continued onwards after the 50s. But this is what I found in the file, and this is what I can gather from the evidence that I have. And so this is the bigger, the significant part of this timeline and what happened. And so if we move on, what are the lessons that we've learned? Basically, it is to protect our hill, and so many efforts, as you can see, have been made to maintain the site, and we don't want to do anything to damage that and undo those efforts. So it is a second home to many of us, and we best take care of it and avoid more fires in the future. The end. Thank you.
Thank you, Preeti. That's for everybody.
Thank you.
So if you have questions, I'll ask you to raise your hand in the participants, or you could type them into the chat window. We have one already from earlier from Scott. How are we archiving and preserving records and correspondence now that so much of it is digital?
Okay. So we did discuss correspondence that is more, that is digital at this time. We haven't done anything with that just yet, because I've been concentrating on our physical documents, the physical paper correspondence. But we've had a quick discussion about what we were going to do with emails, for instance, and electronic based and digital based correspondence. So I think we'll have to come up with some sort of, I guess, database, and somehow start preserving that if we can get to it. I am on contract as well, so we'll have to see what happens.
Just to note, we've had, been in some discussion with the archive records group in Ottawa, and as part of the process in dealing with material, whether it's electronic or physical, it's determining whether something is something that should be archived and sent to Archives Canada or kept in the NRC archives, or is simply records that will eventually get discarded. So there's they'll probably see a gray area there, but there's records, sort of routine stuff that you just eventually don't need anymore, and then you have to decide what is worth archiving and going through the whole process of finding aids, etc. And that might be of interest to the future archival researchers. It's tough because at the time you don't know when something might turn out to be of archival interest, such as these letters about buying trees. I mean, at the time, I'm sure they thought, yeah, these are just like ordinary letters and probably not too interesting to people 60 or 70 years from now, but turns out they are. So it's an interesting interesting dilemma of sorts.
Yes, exactly.
Any other questions for Preeti? Of course, the water tank up at the top of the hill, which is there for fire purposes, wasn't always simply used for fire purposes. In the past, people have been known to swim in it.
Yes.
I was also just going to mention we've had in recent years several nights lost because of smoke from forest fires, just like they did back then. So looking back in August of 2018, a really bad season, we had lost probably about 6 or 7 nights because the smoke was so thick.
Good to know.
So when 1941 camper on the hill, that sounds like that was probably a homeless person of some sort. I mean, it wasn't somebody from Victoria decided to go camping on our observatory grounds for a little vacation.
Yes, that's probably accurate. I did read in one of the reports that is in this file, they were worried about even people passing by and throwing cigarette butts out the window and things like that, just simple things like that.
Yep.
That can create total devastation. So various reasons as to why these fires could have been started or how.
The same is true today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you didn't mention it, but in the correspondence with Dawson,
Mhm.
I mean, you mentioned the person you let the contract to was a personal friend,
Right.
right?
Yes.
Yeah, and so here's this guy in charge of contract, gave it contract to his friend, and then when Pierce kind of intervenes and says this guy's stealing wood or whatever, Dawson says, "No, it's none of your business. There's nothing to see
Yeah.
here. Move on."
Right.
Yeah, so interesting. Uh, let's see here. We have a question from Nat. Is there a
Mhm.
decent fire protection system on the hill these days that could protect from a forest fire that made it all the way to the hill?
So we do have fire hydrants that are in different areas now. So even if you go up the hill between the office and the dome, the hydrant, instead of being on the left side, there's one on the right side. And some of these piping, like this is actually still visible from the hill. I was talking to, when I was talking to Marilyn about it, she was saying that you can actually still see the piping that runs along the road. Plus, I think in the 30s and 40s, there wasn't enough. There weren't enough resources or firefighters and such. So I think now we have better systems in place in general from the city, but there are definitely more fire hydrants that you can see that have been placed even closer to the dome and then the director's house.
They have been used during the fires of the 80s and 90s.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, the fires have been a continual worry and presence on the hill.
Yeah, we did have a fire assessment done for the site. I had seen here.
Hello, Ian.
When was that,
And
Ian?
we did have a fire assessment done for the hill, and we do maintain a regulated fire break around the main buildings, but not for the entire mountain.
Well, of course, that's the area where the 1934 fire burned out all the rocky side is a pretty good fire break right now. So that the worry is there was a fire a few years ago that started on on the path between the main building and the dome, and of course that's worrisome when a fire starts right that close to structures. It doesn't give you much time to react.
And we even had one that started beside the when we were removing the extended tower on the IT building.
Oh yeah.
The contractors, when they're cutting the tower off, the sparks fell down and started a small brush fire, but we put it out locally with our hoses.
Oh my goodness. It's a close call.
So some of the trees that were in the letter seem like interesting, unusual trees for this area. Have any of them survived, and do we know their location today?
I'm not too sure, honestly. I definitely don't know their location because even in the correspondence, they don't really specify which location. They just say in certain areas, we'll choose certain areas for certain trees, and that's where they'll be planted. But they didn't actually specify in those letters where those areas were chosen or what part of the hill. So I'm actually not sure as to which trees are still on the hill.
Yeah, I had the same question, Peter. It'd be interesting to get someone that knows trees to come up and see if they can make the connection between any of the trees we currently have and that list.
Yeah, and if they had actually mentioned which areas they did end up choosing, we could have maybe narrowed down parts of the hill, but it just said, we'll choose the areas and that's about it.
Hey, Preeti, it's Derek here.
Oh, hello.
Can you send me that list, please, of trees? Because right now, Matt Fairbanks, he does the critical habitat areas, they're working on the hill. So I will fire that list off to Matt and just ask that question if he has come across any of these trees in the past and where would they be? And then I can forward you that information to send out to everyone.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. I will send that off to you.
Perfect.
I wondered who this Jacob guy was.
Man,
That's my son. My son's on Zoom more than I am, so he's got his own.
So there were some fruit trees mentioned in those lists, and there were fruit trees where the 2000 wing now is.
That's true.
So they may have, but it also from the correspondence, the later correspondence, it's obvious that keeping them alive proved to be a challenge. So many of those planted in the second half of the 30s may just not have survived.
And also mentioned that little pond that's right outside the door of the main building on the path that leads up to the 72-inch. And there's another pond up by the director's house. Those were put in by Dukeman. Got information from Richard. Richard, anything you want to add personally on this? You were around during some of those fires? I guess not. Tim, you anything to add about? Oh, Richard, you're not. What do you want to add anything?
Am I on?
Yeah, you're on.
Okay, Preeti, that's a great presentation. Brings back lots of memories.
Oh, thank you.
There are some large trees that were inside the gate on the southwest corner of the property that got burned but not destroyed. And I one time was going to take an increment bore and bore into the core of those trees to see if I could find an interruption in the rings, because the trees lost growth for a year, but they still stayed intact. There may be some other trees around that would bear the scar of the fire without having destroyed the life of the tree permanently, but singed it, so to speak.
Tim, do you have anything to say about fires up at GRAO?
Not much. We have some nice videos of them. I guess one thing, the valley's so big and you don't really get a perspective for it all that often until you see the big, 26 meters, this tiny little dot in the middle. But one thing that really drives it home is when you see the big water bombers fly through the valley to put out the fires, and they're just these tiny little planes off in the distance.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's an interesting question. We did have a talk here that I saved by an expert who does study fire in the area, and he gave us a photo of DRAO from 1895 and compared the brush and tree cover on site between now and then. And, it was just kept far more, well, due to more frequent burning, it was less tree-y around the observatory back in the day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
That's,
yeah, definitely the fire keepers and the local bands kept things from getting out of control more than 100 years ago.
wow. It's cool you got a picture from that long ago.
Yeah, very cool.
Okay. Oh, Belma has their hand up. Sorry. I don't know who you are. Sorry.
I had my hand up, but I don't see the screen, so I don't know if I'm on the screen. Dennis, Richard?
Yeah, go ahead. You're on. Go ahead.
Right. Um, I remember in between 1940 when we moved
Oh,
to
it's
the between 40 and 45, there was a fire, and there was of soldiers that were stationed on the observatory property. They had an encampment that was between the old garage, which was Gerling's house, and that shot that Preeti showed where Mr. Dobie and Dukeman were with the fire hose, that was at the top of the hill on the east side. And I can remember I was 4 at the age of 1940, and when I was about 5 or 6, I'm sure, I would be fascinated to go over and go to the campsite of these and beg a sausage or something that they were cooking. They were kind of an unusual presence on the hill for, I would have thought, a week until the danger had passed. But it brings back some memories. Another picture that Preeti showed is how they're directing some workmen to work on the ground. When the fire burned over and was seemingly put out, many places the fire continued to smolder under the moss that lay on a layer on top of the rocks on the hill. And when you went along, everything looked fine, but if you took a spade and uncovered the moss, there you would see the smoldering. The fire was still there. It was quite a phenomenon how the fire stayed around for longer than it was visually thought to be. But I remember the smells, and I remember actually peeling some of the moss away and how hot the rock was where it was still smoldering.
Marilyn. I figured out who Belma is. It's Marilyn. You have your hand up.
Oh, you might be muted.
You're muted, Marilyn, if you're trying to speak. Okay. Any other questions for Preeti or on her presentation? Okay, I don't see any. So, oh, Marilyn, you're unmuted. Go ahead. Nope, nothing. Okay. Just want to make sure there's nothing in the chat window here before I. Belma is. Okay. Thanks everybody for attending, and just let people know we're going to try writing this up for submission to the Journal of the RASC. Just to get it documented for future historians to find out about the fires at Little Sandwich Mountain in the 40s, 30s, and 40s. So that's it for our science tea, and have a good weekend, everybody, and stay safe.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Are we still connected, Dennis?
Yeah, we are. Do you want to say something?
Just to thank you and to thank Preeti. She did a great job, and I didn't realize we may have more records in the archives than I knew about before, and encourages me to look a bit more. I noticed on one of my father's letters back in 1940, the initial secretary, whose last, I think it was LMB, B for Baker, but this was,
Lena Blake.
yes, right, yeah, it was there.
Lorna Blake, pardon me.
And then there was another letter later on, and the secretary was, but I can't remember the last initial, if it was D or not, or L. But that was the next secretary before Doris Fielder took over.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Did I tell you? No, I'll send you an email. It's a bit lengthy. It's okay. Okay. Bye, everyone that's left.